Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep into India's constitution.
Okay.
But not the part everyone talks about. We're not talking about fundamental rights this time.
Right.
We're looking at the directive principles of state policy.
Yeah, these are fascinating, and they're often overlooked.
Yeah. People hear constitution and they think, ugh, boring. But trust me, this is where it gets interesting, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC exam.
Oh, absolutely, because, we always hear about our rights as citizens, but the directive principles are all about the government's responsibilities. Like, how are they supposed to build a just and equitable society?
That's like a blueprint.
Yeah, a blueprint, exactly.
For social and economic progress in India. And we're using Indian polity as our guide for this deep dive. And one thing that jumps out is that these principles, they weren't just, made up in a vacuum. They were inspired by other constitutions like Ireland and Spain.
Right. And it's interesting how India took these global influences and then adapted them, to fit their own context. Like, for example, Article 39. It aims to prevent the concentration of wealth and resources in just a few hands.
Right.
And this was a huge concern in a newly independent nation, obviously dealing with poverty and inequality.
Yeah.
So it echoes similar principles from the Irish Constitution, but it's tailored, to address India's specific challenges.
So it wasn't just a copy-paste job.
No, not at all.
India took these ideas from around the world and made them their own. And the book mentions Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was, a key figure in actually drafting the Indian Constitution. And he saw these principles as innovative and groundbreaking.
Yeah, he really did. He saw them as a roadmap for social and economic progress. And he argued that real freedom, you wouldn't achieve that through just political rights alone.
Right.
He felt these principles were vital to building a society that was not only free, but also just an equitable.
I love this phrase from the book. It's talking about directive principles. And the book calls them the conscience of the Constitution.
Oh, yeah, that's a great phrase.
And I think that really captures it.
It really does. It reminds us that a constitution isn't just, laws and regulations.
Right.
It's about values and aspirations. It's about what we want the nation to be.
Yeah.
So the directive principles, they embody these ideals that India aspires to achieve, the kind of society they want to build.
So they're like a guide for the government when they're making policies and laws.
Right.
But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. The book is very clear that these principles are non-justiciable, which means you can't take them to court if the government's not fulfilling them.
Yeah, this is a really crucial distinction, especially for our UPSC folks out there, because unlike fundamental rights, which are legally enforceable, directive principles are more like a moral compass for the government.
Okay.
They're not about punishment. They're about guiding the nation toward a better future.
And that's what's so interesting, right? Is how do you balance these big aspirational goals with the practical reality of governing?
This is a tough one.
The book draws a really interesting historical connection.
Oh, yeah.
It mentions that these directive principles, they have similarities to the instruments of instructions that were used during British colonial rule.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's a reminder that even as India was breaking free from colonial rule, they adapted some aspects of the previous system to fit their own needs.
Right.
So these instruments of instructions, they served as guidelines for the colonial administration, much like the directive principles are supposed to guide the government of independent India.
That's right.
The book also really emphasizes this vision of a welfare state that's enshrined in the directive principles, a state that's actively working to improve the well-being of all its citizens.
Yeah, it's not just about maintaining law and order like a police state would do.
Really?
It's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
But if they're not legally enforceable, how much weight do they actually carry?
That's the question, isn't it?
The book mentions that courts can use them to assess the validity of laws.
Yes.
So it's not like they're completely toothless.
They definitely have an influence.
Yeah.
Courts might not be able to enforce them directly, but they can use them to interpret laws and determine if those laws are constitutional.
Okay, so to break things down a little bit, the book divides the directive principles into categories. There are socialistic principles, Gandhian principles, and liberal intellectual principles.
It's a real mix of ideologies, all contributing to India's unique approach to governance.
And understanding these different categories is really key, especially if you're thinking about the UPSC exam.
Oh, definitely. It helps you analyze each principle and put it in context.
So let's start with those socialistic principles.
Okay.
These are all about creating a more just and equitable society by tackling things like poverty, inequality, and access to resources.
Right, like Article 38, that's a great example. It directs the state to create a social order that promotes the welfare of the people.
So what does that mean in practice?
Well, it means making sure everyone has access to basic necessities, opportunities for advancement, a decent standard of living, a safety net for the most vulnerable.
Okay, so it's very much about social welfare.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's Article 39, which we talked about a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
That's about preventing the concentration of wealth.
Right, trying to ensure a more fair distribution of economic power so that everyone has a chance to participate and benefit from the nation's progress.
And then there's Article 47.
Yes.
Which focuses on improving the standard of living.
It emphasizes nutrition, recognizing that good health and well-being are essential for individual and national development.
So it's not just about these theoretical rights.
No.
It's about taking concrete actions to improve people's lives.
Absolutely. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how these principles have actually played out in India and what kind of real-world impact they've had.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Directive Principles of State Policy. Before we move on, I want to say something to all the UPSC aspirants listening. You know these principles. They aren't just abstract concepts, things you have to memorize for the exam.
Right.
They're a framework for understanding how India actually tries to function as a nation.
That's such a good point. So we've talked about the what and the why of these principles. But now I think it's time to move on to the how. Like, how have these ideals actually played out in India? What real-world impact have they had?
Well, the book Indian Polity gives us some really great examples. So take the Planning Commission, for example. It's been replaced by Niti Aayog now.
Right.
But the Planning Commission was originally created to guide India's economic and social development.
Okay.
And that was a direct reflection of the Directive Principles, specifically those outlined in Articles 38 and 39.
And those articles are all about?
Yeah, they emphasize social and economic justice, making sure everyone has a chance to benefit from the nation's progress.
So even though these principles can't be enforced in court,
they've definitely influenced some big policy decisions.
Absolutely.
It's like they set the stage for the government to think about development in this more holistic way.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just these big overarching bodies like the Planning Commission.
Okay.
The book also talks about the impact on land reform.
Okay.
A lot of states implemented land reforms with the goal of redistributing land ownership and trying to improve the lives of people in rural communities.
So that connects back to Article 39.
Yes.
Which is all about preventing the concentration of wealth.
Exactly.
It's amazing how these principles were written so long ago.
I know.
But they still resonate with the issues we're facing today, like land ownership and economic inequality.
Yeah, they really do.
And that's why I think understanding the Directive Principles is so important, not just for the UPSC exam, but for anyone who wants to have these informed discussions about where India is going.
Absolutely. They give us a framework for analyzing policies, for figuring out if they're working, and even for coming up with new solutions. The book also mentions all the labor laws in India.
Right.
Like the Minimum Wages Act, the Payment of Wages Act, and the Factories Act.
All about protecting workers.
Yeah.
So those laws reflect the principles in Articles 41, 42, and 43, which focus on things like ensuring the right to work, making sure working conditions are fair, and promoting a decent standard of living for workers.
Okay, so it's really about social justice for the working class.
Yeah, recognizing that economic growth can't come at the cost of exploiting workers.
So we see these principles touching on so many parts of life in India. It's not just about the economy. It's about building a society that's both prosperous and just.
Right.
And what about environmental protection?
Oh, yeah, great point. The book talks about acts like the Wildlife Protection Act and the Forest Conservation Act.
Okay.
And those are really concrete examples of Article 48A, which calls for protecting and improving the environment.
It's incredible how much influence these principles have had, even though they're not legally enforceable.
It's really remarkable.
They've shaped so many policies and laws in India.
It just goes to show the power of having a clear vision, even without the force of law behind them. These principles have guided policymakers, they've influenced public opinion, And they've provided a way to hold the government accountable.
And I think this is where it gets really interesting for our UPSC listeners.
Yeah.
Because the exam is all about making these connections between abstract principles and real-world actions.
Exactly.
And that's the kind of analytical thinking that's going to help you stand out.
The UPSC isn't just about knowing facts. It's about understanding the nuances.